We're in the greenhouse today because I'm going to be doing a full container herb garden, and this is something that I get a lot of requests for, herbs and container gardens in general. So I wanted to go through the full step-by-step process and kind of talk about not just planting it, but maintaining it, kind of keeping on top of harvesting and taking care of something like this, because it's a little bit different than if you are growing in the ground. So I did make a run to the store, so we're going to go through everything that I got to plant in this container today. But I did want to go into a little bit of why you might want to plant a container garden. I think probably the most obvious reason you might want to do this is if you're really limited on space. This pot is pretty decent sized, I would say maybe 3 to 5 gallons, and you can fit this on your front steps. It just needs to be somewhere where it's getting about 6 to 8 hours of full direct sunlight a day, because herbs really do like a lot of sun. But there's a lot of other reasons why I like to continue to grow in containers, even though technically I have space to do my herbs in something larger. First of all, if you're in an area with cold winters like I am here in zone 6B, this will allow you to overwinter things that are maybe a little bit more difficult to overwinter in your zone. So you do have some basil here, which is an annual, but other things like different sages, lavenders, rosemaries have some varieties that tend to be more cold hardy than others, but I've tried even like the cold hardy varieties of rosemary outside, and I've never been able to get them to overwinter. So if you already have your herbs in a container, it's very easy to move them back inside for the winter months when it starts to get cooler, and they won't be as productive because they're not getting as much light around that time, but it allows you to overwinter them so that you have more bigger established plants going into the spring. Another huge benefit is how much money it saves you on groceries. Like, I don't know if you guys have tried to get fresh herbs at the grocery store anytime recently, but those little like clamshell plastic packs are like $4 to $6. It's ridiculous, and that can be fine if you can't find herbs anywhere else to plant your container garden, depending what time of year you're trying to do this. That can be a good way to actually propagate herbs depending on the varieties, and I'll get into more of that in our herb propagation video, but for this video we're not going to talk about it too much. That's for like 1 to 2 ounces of herbs fresh that you're getting at the grocery store for $4 to $6, versus an entire potted plant like this is usually around $4, and some of them will even have, like this one, all these basil plants. Like, this is not one basil plant, this is like 10 or 15 basil plants all in one container, which has its pros and cons, which we'll get into when we start planting. But overall, like, you're getting so much more because you're going to be able to continuously harvest from these as you need them all summer long, and sometimes into fall and winter too. So you're getting really, really fresh herbs for your cooking. You could also pick varieties that maybe aren't as easy to find at the grocery store. There's so many different kinds of basil, oregano, thyme, even like sage. All of these come in different varieties depending on if you like things that maybe taste more like licorice or have more spice. You can kind of make it more custom to your flavor palette. And then the last thing I will say about benefits for doing container herb gardens is they make excellent gifts. And spoiler alert, this is actually a gift today. We're making this for Linda, and we're going to be putting together a little mini herb garden for her birthday. I love to do stuff like this because, especially with herbs, even if you're not a gardener, which Linda is a gardener, they're really easy to care for, even if you don't know a lot about plants. So it's a really great starting point for beginners. It can be really thoughtful too. Like, Linda does a lot of Italian cooking, so we kind of tried to pick herbs that we knew she liked to use specifically in her cooking. And it's something where it's really simple to put together, but it does require a little bit of effort and thought. So it's a thoughtful gift without being kind of very pro-consumerism in a way. I love to do container gardens for gifts all of the time, not just herb gardens. I've done container tea gardens, even just annual flower arrangements that you can do in a container can be really fun. So if you want to see more container stuff like that, let me know. We can kind of throw together some recipes. And if you have a huge container, you can do a huge variety of things. I just grabbed 4 different things today. I do have a lot of extra basil here that I just grabbed for my own garden at the same time, but we did grab some basil. So we have this whole pot here, which we won't probably use all of these because that would take up probably this entire container, if not more. One basil plant really is kind of like good for a foot. I do like 4 per square foot, but considering some other elements that will be going on here, we'll probably only do 2 or 3 of these basil plants in here. Now, basil is kind of more of a water-loving, water hog plant, and a lot of herbs are considered like more Mediterranean, and they like to dry out, especially rosemary. So it can be kind of tricky planting basil with these other herbs that like to dry out. And there's a couple of things that we can do to kind of mitigate that, which I'll get into when we start planting. I also got this Tuscan blue rosemary. I just thought it looked really healthy, and rosemary is really drought tolerant. So I typically do plant this in my terracotta because it kind of likes to dry out, but it's also really easy to propagate. So once you have one rosemary plant, you can also make propagations of this and get even more plants out of it. We also grabbed this purple sage. So you can see the stems on this are actually purple. I love throwing sage in with my pasta dishes. Sage butter is just, it doesn't get any better than that in my opinion. But I've also seen people take like little chunks of cheese and roll it inside of a sage leaf and kind of spear it with a toothpick as a little hors d'oeuvre, which sounds so good. And then we also got this Italian oregano. Like I said, there's Greek oregano and Italian. I usually grow Greek, but I thought Linda likes Italian cooking. We'll try an Italian variety. Both are delicious. And we're gonna make some new tags for these so that they all match, so that she can keep track of what's what in the container, because there's just kind of these big tags in here right now. But I already filled my container with potting soil. So let's get into kind of the different container options and soil mixes that you might wanna use. So in terms of size, it's really just gonna be dictated by how many things you wanna plant. A basil plant typically takes up a lot more room than thyme, but this is kind of like your mid-size container. It doesn't need to be anything huge. Generally speaking, herbs don't have really deep root systems. I would say this one's about 8 to 10 inches tall, and I don't think you need to go any deeper than that for your herbs. It is really important that whatever container you decide to use has really good drainage, and there's a couple of elements to this. First of all, it needs to have the holes in the bottom so the water can escape, but also you may see people talking about actually putting like broken up pottery, gravel, pieces of old plastic in the bottom to improve drainage. This is actually a myth. All that's effectively doing is raising the water table height, so it's actually pushing water up into the soil bed, so it doesn't really have any beneficial effect on the drainage of the mix. What's really important for drainage is to use a soil that's going to drain really well, which we'll get into in a second. As far as materials, this is just a plastic pot that's made to look like terracotta. You can use terracotta. I wouldn't use terracotta if you're planting basil, just because it is water loving. If you're going to plant basil in a clay container, just make sure it's glazed on the outside. It doesn't have to be glazed on the inside. That can be raw, rough clay. But with it glazed on the outside, that will just hold a little bit more of the moisture in. For our Mediterranean herbs, if you want to just do those, a terracotta pot is totally fine. Otherwise, your safest bet is just a glazed ceramic of any kind. And glazed just means it has kind of that shiny painted finish on the outside. Soil is going to be a much bigger, more important factor for drainage in a container versus adding kind of that gravel hack I was talking about at the bottom. You really need to use a potting mix in a container because regular raised bed or garden soil is too heavy. It actually has way too much real dirt in it, too much soil. So potting mix is typically actually made with either no soil or very little actual soil, and it mostly has things like peat moss and coco coir in it, and that makes it really light and fluffy while still being able to hold on to enough moisture that it doesn't drain out really, really fast. Some of the mixes will dry out faster than others, and I do find in containers it's a really good idea to add a mulch on the top of them to keep them from drying out. Not as important in the case of an herb garden where we don't mind for it to dry out a little bit more, but if you're planting other things, it's a good idea. I like to do leaf mold as a mulch in my containers because it's still really lightweight, but it does hold that moisture in really well on the top. So I did just fill this up with our potting mix. Now, because it is a container garden, it's going to run out of nutrients a lot faster than a raised bed, and especially with it being smaller and we're really packing the plants in here. I like to make it look really nice and full. So because we're kind of ignoring the plant spacing guidelines here, I want to make sure I'm doing everything I can to give these plants a boost right off from the start so that Linda doesn't have to do a lot of work to it, at least for the first month or so. So the best way to do that is to add a granular plant food as an amendment to the soil. And I like to use a granular plant food because it just lasts longer. It's kind of like a slower release, if that makes sense, than adding like a liquid plant food, because it's going to dissolve slowly over time. So I just put a little bit in. I never measure this. There are usually measurements on the side of your packaging, but I just kind of like coat the surface lightly and then blend it into the top 2 to 3 inches of the soil. It's going to get more mixed in as we plant the plants and as we actually water the plants too. The soil in here is pre-moistened. It doesn't have to be because we're not planting seeds here, we're doing transplants, but I just find it's a little bit easier to work with and a little bit less messy if I pre-moisten it. And then we don't have to water it as heavily and potentially have things kind of move around once we get them into place. As for where you're gonna wanna put a container like this, again, we just wanna make sure it's getting about 6 to 8 hours of sunlight every day, somewhere that's really accessible and easy for you, especially with an herb garden. We wanna make sure that we can just kind of pop outside really quickly even as we're cooking and grab what we need and be able to access it from all sides if it's a bigger container that we can't easily turn. And then one other consideration that's probably not like make or break is just kind of putting it somewhere semi-protected from strong winds. With herbs, we're less worried about pests, so it can be lower down and you're less likely to have issues. Generally things that are really aromatic, for whatever reason, the pests don't like them as much. So I don't usually have issues with pests munching on these, and that I'm referring specifically to like bunnies and chipmunks and squirrels and things like that. Materials, again, I like to keep things super simple. You need your container, you need your soil, preferably a granular plant food, and either a hori-hori or a trowel, whatever is convenient for you. I've been obsessed with the hori-hori this year. I find it very easy to work with and fun to work with. And then you're just gonna need a water source by the end of this. As far as just planting these out, I'm gonna start with the basil because like I said, we do kind of have to do a little bit here to make sure that these plants are happy together because the basil in particular is going to want more water. So when we're thinking about where should we plant things in the container, I like to put the basil more toward the center because the center is going to stay the wettest the longest and the outer edges will dry out first, which will make those plants that like to be dry a little bit happier. Now I am planting this a little bit later in the season, so these have already been sitting in their pot in the nursery probably a little bit longer than I would like. I'm not unhappy about this. So when we're looking at plants of the nursery, this kind of like circling where we see lots of white roots on the outside means that it's been in the planter a little bit too long. But if we look at the bottom, it's really not like so bad. I've seen it like where all these lines, it's just one dense mat and I literally will have to saw that off. So this is not terrible, especially considering how many basil plants are in here. But these basil plants are planted way too close together, and I don't want to shock them. Normally I would kind of like manhandle this and rip them apart and they would get super wilty and probably take a couple of weeks to come back to life after doing that to them. So there is kind of a gap here, and I specifically picked this pot for this reason because I know I want these to look good for when I give them to Linda in just a few days. So what I'm gonna do is actually take advantage of the gap that's already forming here and use my hori-hori because it does have like a sharp edge to it to actually just saw this in half. And believe it or not, this is less traumatic to the plant than me just pulling it apart. It smells so good in here. I wish you guys could smell this. And then I have 4 plants here, and 2 of them are a little bit smaller than the others, and that's fine. I am gonna cut it in half one more time just to loosen it up. Because really we should only be doing 1 basil in here. I want it to look nice and full, and 2 will be okay, so we're gonna do 2. So I don't wanna loosen this any more than I already have because we did a lot of damage to the plant, although probably most of the roots on the outside are where these ones are coming from, and it really wasn't tightly compacted or anything like that. I just wanna be careful with it. So I'm gonna dig down and we're just gonna plant this so that the depth matches the existing depth of the basil plant and firm that in gently. Okay, so that's gonna be our centerpiece. These are the things that are going to get the largest, kind of grow up toward the middle of the container. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If it's something really tall and it could shade out stuff if you put it toward the edge, you want to make sure you're not doing that. So I'll do my rosemary next. This one looks like it was started in one pot. You can kind of see the edge of it here and then moved into this bigger pot, and that first pot hasn't even fully disintegrated. So I'm kind of just pulling out that remaining liner from the old pot, and it feels really loose in here, which is good. And that's another thing you can be looking for when you're getting plants from the nursery, is if you can squeeze the sides really easily, because that generally means it's not going to be as root bound, especially if you can't see through the pot and you don't want to be pulling the plant out in the nursery. So I'm just going to tip this over, pull it out. So this looks perfect. So this is what we want ideally. If you remember looking back at the basil here, how many white roots we can see compared to our rosemary. This one just doesn't have as much, but it's still established in the pot. So I am actually going to lose some of this soil on the top here just because I'm seeing some kind of moss basically, and it's harmless, but since we already have really good fresh soil in here, we just don't need it, so I'm just gonna brush it off. All right, so I just lost some of that soil up here, and you can see it's making it floppy. If you're intimidated by this process, you definitely don't have to do what I just did. I've just planted a lot of things, and I just have a preference to kind of remove as much of that old soil as possible, especially where I have like limited room in this container. So I just wanted to remove that, but it does mean I have to be a little bit more mindful of where that planting point is, because we don't want to plant it down here. We want to plant it like up here. So I have to go a little bit deeper than I maybe would think. I'll turn this for you. So I'm gonna just pop this right in the corner, right on the edge, I mean, and pushing it down because it's just feeling kind of floppy. And sometimes when I get a floppy transplant, I like to give it an extra pat down so that it can feel really secure in its spot and not kind of wonder, okay, where do I go now? Like, roots like to have contact. So this is still a little bit low. So I'm gonna kind of pile up that soil around it a bit. There we go. See how it's not really wobbling as much now? So things are gonna look a little bit leggy in here when we first get started, but I'll talk about how you can prune things so that they get really bushy and produce even more. So since we have 4 plants total, we did 1 in the center, we did 1 right here. I'm thinking of this in kind of a triangle shape, if that makes sense. So we'll do 1 more here and 1 more right out back here. So we'll do this first one right here, and that will be our oregano. This is a beautiful, like, sprawling plant, and some people will actually plant this whole container because it is biodegradable. I don't like to do that because I feel like it's just one more thing that the roots have to work through, and they don't biodegrade that fast. They do biodegrade, but not as fast as I would like them to. So I tend to just peel it off. Sometimes you can just pop the whole plant out, but sometimes they're like really formed to them. I don't really like these. I like that they're biodegradable, but I find that they hold a lot of moisture in, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So it's kind of sticking to the soil here, and you can see mold forming on all of this. Again, it's probably not harming the plant. Like, the plant looks great, but I don't know. I don't want mold in my planter. So I'm loosening a bunch of this soil again because I'd just rather not have it. And I do feel like they left these biodegradable collars on that are kind of, that's not even biodegradable. That looks like plastic. So because this was transplanted in something that it was like a small plug cell that was lined with like almost like a weed barrier material, all of the new roots are growing out of the bottom, but there's not really a lot along the sides, which I don't love. These are issues you don't always come across when you're planting herbs. And these herbs look great, but I'm just being extra detailed and nitpicky here because it's an interesting opportunity to show you what can happen when you get herbs from the store. It's not always plug and play, although it usually is. So we'll pop this one right here. And I like to think about how I want it to trail, right? So a trailing one like this, you don't even have to go straight up and down. We can kind of angle it to encourage it to drape over the edge like that. And just re-add that soil and pat down. Okay, so this one can kind of trail out this way, which will leave our basil plenty of room to breathe, because basil is one, we don't want it to get really wet when it's kind of gets rained on. We want it to be able to dry out fast, so it's important that it has circulation. So our last one is this purple sage. Now I think this could get pretty big. When you're planting in a container like this and it's more of like an arrangement, we can ignore the plant spacing recommendations to a degree because it's going to limit the growth. It won't get as big as it could. And that is what those plant recommendations are generally talking about. They're not saying if you plant it smaller, it's not going to live. They're just saying it's not going to get to the size that we're telling you it could get to, which in this case is totally fine. And next year, if she wants, and these do overwinter well for her, she can pull out everything but the basil, which won't overwinter since it's an annual. And she could kind of move them into their own containers if she wanted, or just move just the sage and keep the thyme and the rosemary together. Okay, that is looking pretty cute. I'm liking this. Of course, there are some empty spaces around, but we need that. We need the space for the plants to grow. They're still just baby plants. So in terms of taking care of this container, when we think about watering, we need to think about the fact that containers do dry out a lot faster than our in-ground gardens. But really all you need to do is do the finger test. So I just stick a finger about an inch deep into the soil, and you want to make sure that you're still feeling moisture. The soil is sticking to your finger at that depth. If it's really hard and crumbly on the surface, that usually means it's drying out too much. So typically with a container, I'm watering every 1 to 3 days, depending on how hot it is and where it's located. When you do water, I want you to water really thoroughly. So you're gonna water until you see that excess water starting to come out of the bottom drain holes. And again, that basil is gonna prefer slightly hotter and slightly wetter environment. So it may not do as well as it might if it were completely on its own. The rest of these are really good companions for each other. You can fertilize something like this every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on what kind of fertilizer you're using. Just use a regular, standard, balanced fertilizer. I like to top off my containers with the granular plant food about every 4 weeks. So a granular doesn't have to be done as often as, say, a liquid, which you'd probably be doing every 2 weeks. And then harvesting and pruning kind of go hand in hand here, and they're really important for herbs. So even if you're not thinking you're gonna use an herb very frequently, it's a good idea to keep on top of the pruning. So we'll talk about each of these individually. As far as basil, I want to say this is the hardest one for people to get right. So a lot of times people will pick their basil, and here, let me just grab one that I can show you up closer. So I'm just going to show you on this one because it's a really good example. People tend to harvest their basil by just picking off the individual leaves, right? But if we do that, it's just going to keep growing up, 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 and getting really leggy and not producing a whole bunch. What we want to actually do is pinch off the whole basil right here above a leaf node. And what that is there's 2 new baby leaves starting to form along this stem. So if we cut it right here, those 2 new baby leaves will form 2 entire new branches that will branch off in a Y shape, and it will get really bushy and full, and you'll get double, triple, quadruple the harvest. It's really the best and only way to prune any type of basil plant, no matter if you've got purple basil, Thai basil, I don't care. You want to do it this way. You also need to be doing this regularly with basil because it tends to bolt if it gets too hot or if we just aren't pruning it enough. And that just means that it starts to send out flowers, which will then send out seeds. And as soon as you start seeing those flowers, the stems and everything start to get really hard and tough and bitter, and the leaves are really no good anymore. I still like to use them at that point for dried basil, but it's just, if you can avoid getting to that point, the best way to do that, even if you're not going to use your basil right away, is to just do that pinching method, prune it off. And it will last if you just pop it in a glass of water on your countertop. You can use it in a few days when you are ready to use basil. And that's a really good way to propagate your basil too, if you want to make more basil plants. For the rosemary, I'm harvesting it a little bit less often. It does kind of have the same thing here where there's little baby leaf rosemary. So if we were to cut it down, we would end up branching off and getting it a much bushier and fuller plant. And we don't want to prune right away or harvest right away. We want to give these time to establish themselves in their new container. But after about 2 to 3 weeks, you could definitely do a harvest if it seemed like it was ready for it. I don't generally do individual leaves of rosemary. I'll pull off a whole stem, usually about 1/3 of the length of whatever stem you're cutting can come off at a time. And it's really important to do this at the very end of the season with your perennial herbs like rosemary so that they don't get really woody, because we want to keep it short for the winter. Otherwise, all that old growth is going to get really woody and hard again, and we're going to have that issue where instead of it being nice and green and bushy and full down low, it's just going to kind of start being green and bushy up high, and you'll just have bare brown stems down low. Sage is a little bit different, so you can do it the same way to encourage bushiness where you're going to be cutting above leaf nodes, but you can also, because sage is such an overpowering flavor, I know, you can just pull individual leaves. I tend to just prefer to do the same pinching method on my sage as well. Now with sage and rosemary, you're not harvesting necessarily every single week. The basil you maybe could, depending on the time of year. But these two, I would say it's really important to do maybe 2 to 3 big harvests throughout the season, spaced fairly evenly apart so that it has time to recover and bounce back. The oregano and thyme as well, which we didn't plant here, but it has a very similar growth habit. You can just go to town on this. It's very forgiving of pruning. There's nothing specific that I would say you need to do. If you end up deciding to follow the same schedule where you just kind of do a big prune harvest about 2 to 3 times a year, you can literally just take this whole bunch, hold it, chop it down. One other thing I did want to say, if you're just thinking about other plants that you might want to do for a container herb garden, please don't put mint in one of these containers unless it's the only thing that you're gonna plant in that container. Mint takes over. So you will see like a container like this that has 4 different things, including mint, and within a few months, all you will have is mint. And that's okay because, I mean, mint should be grown in a container regardless, but I prefer to grow it in its own container so that it's not competing with the other plants in that container. And there are so many different kinds of mint. I really like to do apple mint. That's one of my favorites. But spearmint's really good, of course. You can do regular peppermint. Honestly, that's the one thing I see like the most variety of at the nurseries is different flavors of mint that are supposed to taste kind of more fruity or more sweet. You really shouldn't deal with a lot of pests or diseases on your herbs. Something about all the essential oils in them tends to resist a lot of those fungal issues that you might see in other parts of your garden. So it's really, really easy. Like it's pretty much foolproof as long as you keep to those pruning methods and keep in mind what you're planting with what. I would say basil and mint are kind of the trickier ones to do in terms of how well they play with others. I did debate putting some lemon balm in this one as well, but that one can also get pretty aggressive like mint. So it's usually best for its own container. So I'm gonna get this cleaned up and then add my labels. And for the labels, I'm literally just going to take these white labels. I just get them in like packs of 300. I'm just gonna write on that with Sharpie. The wood ones are so cute, but I find that the second that they get wet, even with a Sharpie, it does not stay put. So we'll just have one of these at each plant so she'll know what it is without having to Google anything, and she can just harvest and enjoy. But let me know if you have any specific questions about planting a container garden, or if there's any specific kind of recipe you want to see me plant. I love projects like this. It's so satisfying and easy. If you really wanted to fill it out and it was the right time of year, you could do like a pansy in each of these empty spots because they would kind of die back and not be in competition with the herbs by the time the herbs started to fill in. Or you could even do some marigold, add some more color to it. So there's just so many options, so many different ways to do it. I really hope this video was helpful. Make sure you hit like and subscribe so you don't miss future videos like this one, and I'll see you next time.